Our text for today is Chapter 3 of Darwin's On the Origin of Species. The chapter is titled Struggle for Existence. Darwin makes two important points that I want to call your attention. Darwin makes it that when we look at nature closely, we find that the appearance of order and harmony and peace is deceptive. When we look closely at the way that nature works, we find peace and struggle and war and violence and killing and death. What is the driving force of evolution and formation of the new species? And what did Darwin actually mean by the term struggle for existence? Darwin's theory was intended to provide an evolutionary mechanism for natural selection as a causal explanation for the origin of species, and thus the observed patterns of common ancestry, in contrast to the widespread idea that species were created independently. Darwin said that every individual organism was slightly different from every other, and since there were limits on the resources required to sustain life, thus leading to a struggle for existence, organisms with any adventurous characters would tend to leave more offspring. Here's the outline of Chapter 3. Darwin talks about the problem of defining species boundary. Darwin discusses the struggle for life is very important, and he talks about the principle of geometric increase, where he talks about how different species can grow if uninterrupted, and he talks about different checks against those increase, and not only on single cases. There could be mutual checks to increase in multiple species as well. And finally, he discussed about the severity of struggle. What defines species boundaries? Darwin observed that there are individual variation in individual member of a species, and also the first chapter he establishes that there can be different varieties of species, as well as different breeds or different strains. So a very important question remains how these varieties, that incipient species, can be converted into a new and distinct and good species. So defining the species boundary is a really complex question. Because, first of all, when you need accumulation of small traits or small changes in different traits, we can expect that different lineage will continue to gather new changes, and eventually that changes will be so different that these two realities be very distinct, and we can also think peace about not only in species level, but also in a genus or other orders of tree of life. So when Darwin talks about the struggle for life, we have to be careful because there's a bitter foe. And by the struggle is not always he referred to competition, but he also indicates the dependence as well. Darwin thinks the struggle for existence is key for new species formation. To answer that, we have to understand the principle of geometric increase. By that, Darwin means that if the reproduction and the growth of a species is unchecked, it will increase in number in very small time, and the number will be really high. So the thing is here that in nature, more individuals are produced compared to the potential survivors. This is frequently found in different taxa or different species, and the matter, therefore, the revelation and growth needed to be under constant check. Otherwise, there will be more space for all members, and all members of species in the ark, for example. If you look at the elephant, elephants are the slowest breeder, and they can live for a really long time. They generally get to the reproductive maturity around 30 years old, and they can be reproductively active until 19, never age. So in their lifetime, a single couple of elephants can give 3 pairs. Now, if you calculate that, in 500 years from this single couple of elephants, 15 million new members of elephants will be born. This is really insane. So this is how the geometric increase works. So how nature constantly checks the geometric increase, well, there are several methods of, first of all, many animals and many plants dare actually serve as a food for other animals. And in this process, a new member of a species are always eaten by by the other species, and thus this will keep the number law and again change in climate. Also play a really big role, especially if there is extreme cold or hot event that will eventually reduce the available food for a species. And that will also keep the number low again for a new climate or a new environment. Other animals or other species might be slightly better treated. They have higher chance for survival in the new climate, so they will also keep the number of the first species low. Finally, they can be epidemic or diseases that may adversely affect a species number. Darwin also discussed that in nature, a different species can interact in a way that there is a mutual check to increase, and this can generate a balancing force which can exist in the nature for a very long period of time. He gives an example of Scott Fried, kind of quiz, and cattle and can graze those trees and eliminate those from a field. So the number of cattle is ultimately controlling the number of trees available for the next generation. But again, insects can affect the cattle, and this way they can control the number of cattle. So as well, again, can eat those insects and keep their numbers low. So there's always a check and balance in the process of subsequent interaction. So if the number of trees become very low, this will also affect the population of insects, and the number of insects will get low as well. They will ultimately lower the number so there is less trees for the cattle, and ultimately there will be less food given, and they don't have any source of food, and this will control the growth of particles or taxism. Darwin also comments on the severity of struggle. Darwin comments that we will do the same, or the competition will deliver the same species. They will require occupation of the same area. They will need the same food, or they are exposed in the same danger. Therefore, any variation of a trait, if introduced, and that variation of the trait increases the chance of survival and reproduction slightly. In a bit will be selected for the next generation of interspecies. I also wanted to touch on criticisms during the time. Jackson Mivart contended with his criticisms of Darwin. He mentioned at one point milk could not have evolved from a scarcely nutritious fluid from an accidentally hypertrophied cutaneous gland. And then David Quammen contended that the foundations of science had shifted beneath their feet, but they didn't notice. Why not? This is hard to know. Possibly it was because the excerpts from Darwin. So, in other words, they were given criticisms of his work.